story was this. From over the course of the 12th and 13th century into the 14th century, a form of evil which is directly traced by the Venetians themselves to the ancient Canaanite city of Tyre had arisen to great power in the north of the Adriatic Sea, the city of Venice, which has been in recent time, until he moved to London, the residence of Satan on earth. These people grew great power. They built a maritime power in the image of ancient Phoenicia, which is Canaan. Phoenicia is a Greek word. The people of that region were called the Canaanites. And the center of evil was Tyre. Tyre was destroyed by a great man, Alexander the Great. But the principle of Tyre lived on. And it came through the Roman Empire, it came to reside in Venice. And from about 800 AD on, Venice was an increasing power in the Mediterranean and became a great sea power, which became a dictatorship over the Mediterranean over the period from the course of the 12th century into the beginning of the 13th century with the so-called Fourth Crusade. And I can tell you all the Crusades were frauds. They were all run by the Venetians. Nothing to do with Christianity. They had to do with something else. The Fourth Crusade was organized by Venice to conquer and loot Byzantium, which is its major competitor. And the Latin Empire in Byzantium was set up from 1204 to 1261, when a fellow called Michael Palaeologus overthrew it on behalf of the Greeks. But Venice became a great looting power. It crushed every element of civilization. It imposed evil cults. It spread the cult of Aristotle throughout the Mediterranean and other cults. It looted everything. It imposed its debt every place. It manipulated nations into making war on one another. They weren't real nations, but they were whatever passed for at that time. They plunged Europe into war and usury and looting and bestiality and cruelty, and nothing could seem to stop it. The political institutions of Europe collapsed at about 1250, or over the period 1250 to 1267, in a series of wars. A leading figure of the late 13th century and early 14th century, Dante Alighieri, typified those who fought desperately to save civilization from this pestilence of Venice and the Venetians' Mongol allies, who are attacking Europe from the west, from the east. Venice's power grew. Dante was probably murdered by the Venetians after a trip into Venice and its area. The ideas of Dante lived on through various networks. Not only Dante, but there were great Franciscans and others who continued the tradition, the Augustinian tradition, and developed it then as before. Then in the middle of the century, the 14th century, the whole system collapsed in a chain reaction of bankruptcy, starting with the King of England discovering, by checking with his priest, that not only was usury a mortal sin, but that he, as the King of England, by continuing to pay his debts to usury, was actually contributing to the eternal damnation of the soul of his creditors. So the King of England repudiated his debts to the houses of Bardi and Peruzzi, which were Florentine-based, but they were key bankers of the period, who had looted every part of Europe through this bank. It's very much like the IMF conditionalities today. As a matter of fact, the IMF conditionalities are a repetition, a continuation of the Venetian tradition. They are evil. The people who run the IMF are evil. The bureaucrats of the IMF as a collectivity are purely evil. They are mass murderers. They have already killed far more people on this planet than Adolf Hitler succeeded in doing. They are wiping out the people of developing countries. What they've contributed to with their English masters, including Linda Chalker, who is the colonial minister. They call it overseas development now, but she's really the colonial minister from the House of Lords, who was given to us by Lady Thatcher, who is reputed to be a witch because she succeeded in transforming a merely bankrupt England into a rubbish heap. And also because of the way she handled her pet cat, George Bush. Who, by the way, is no friend of mine. So these people were crushed, and their political power was crushed by their bankruptcy. There's an analogy today. I'm not Plutarch, and I'm not a priest of the cult of Apollo, as he was, but comparisons are sometimes permitted. Today, as then, in the middle of the 14th century, the new Venetian Empire, which is the British Empire, or the Anglo-Dutch Empire, or whatever you want to call it, it's the same thing, is based on financial power. All finance and monetary systems today are divorced entirely from trade and production. They're engaged in pure speculation, in usury, debt as a form of usury, the looting of countries, of whole regions of the world, the power of the ruling oligarchy, which are like Venetian families, Ford Foundation, this foundation, that foundation. This is what runs the United States, not the government. This is what runs the world, not the governments. The governments are run by these powerful families and their oligarchical connections, who control the Washington Post. They control the New York Times. They control the 3 TV networks. They control Jane Fonda. She might not admit it, but she's a real right-wing fascist, that Jane. They are looting the world. They have great power. People are afraid of them. They're afraid of the press. The Congress is afraid of the press. The Justice Department is controlled by these families. Everything is rotten is controlled by these families. People say, be smart. Don't get into trouble. Don't attack them. Don't attack the Queen of England. How can you not attack her? She's killing all those people. You're going to keep quiet about it? What, are you going to involved in misprision of a felony by not attacking the Queen of England? So the time has come, we say, well, what if these people suddenly lose their financial power? What if these banks go bankrupt? What if the IMF is liquidated? What if the international monetary institutions don't function? What if there's no facility by which these institutions can exert their power over society? Something like that which happened during the 14th century, the so-called Dark Age.
In 1000, the Byzantine Empire underwent a fundamental crisis. That was the period when Venice started to take over more and more of Europe, and eventually the power center shifted to the financial oligarchy in Venice. So then in 1066, the Normans took over England, and the Saxons got defeated, and then eventually Venice for a very long time remained the power center of the imperial structure. So you are really looking at a succession of different empires. Now naturally Venice in this period, in this long period, underwent changes, family changed, replaced others, but the oligarchical structure essentially remained the same.
Centuries had passed from the day the ruling families left Rome, and the Venetians rapidly asserted a maritime dominance that no one could or would dare to challenge. Recognizing her might, the Istrians begged Venice for protection from Slavic pirates. This protection was granted gracefully, at the price of 100 jars of wine per year. Though her mother, Byzantium, interfered with her desire of controlling a global financial maritime empire, as Byzantium still controlled the trade routes of the East, Venice overcame these circumstances and managed to secure trading privileges over Byzantium's territories. They accomplished this by making the emperor fearful of foreign attack, an attack which Venice herself was well equipped to foment. the 20 to 30 rolling Venetian families prided themselves on being descendants of the imperial Rome of Caesar. But whether they were really related by flesh or not, they were descendants of Rome's imperial ideology, for this oligarchy was clearly committed to the ancient model that created Rome, and were determined to ensure that Venice would embody empire.
Be thou unique in the isolation of thy sight. None shall resemble thee. In thy freedom from pope and emperor, none shall rival thee. The city thou buildest on the ooze of the lagoon shall outlast the rock-built cities of the crag and the broad-laid cities of the plain. Out of thine incessant combat with the sea shall come thy strength. Thy soul shall delight in beauty, and beautiful shall be thy handiwork.
Of course, anything that could come from the handiwork of Venice would be anything but beautiful. Her handiwork was one of dumping many into wars while making them believe that the Venetians were really their ally and that they shared common interests. Like its descendants in the British Empire of today, Venice had no permanent allies, only permanent interests. To gain her interests, emperors and kings were to play her game, and if they refused or retaliated, they would simply meet their doom. Byzantium was one significant force that chose not to play her game. This was troublesome, for without Constantinople she would lose access to the Black Sea and all the treasures that lay in Asia and the Middle East. Ultimately, Constantinople did fall to the Venetians, not by her own hand, but by the hand she manipulated.
The Venetians are very good at psychological warfare as well. That if you read Friedrich Schiller's Ghost Seer, you can see that what you do is you pretend to be people's friends. You find out what they want, what their weakness is, and you give it to them. If they want money, you give them money. If they want sex, you arrange for that. If they want drugs, you arrange for that. Whatever it is they want, their weakness is, you feed them. And then you tell them, okay, I'm doing all this for you and I just need these little favors. And you corrupt them. And you corrupt them until you can control them. And of course, you know what they're doing, so you can always blackmail them if they try to get out of line. But basically what controls them is the knowledge that if they don't go along with you, then they lose out on all these things they like. You know, if they play ball with you, then they become rich, they become famous, they have all of their desires sated, they get everything that they want, but in a mental state which is increasingly depraved and subject to manipulation. And that's also the Venetian method, that you win by corruption. And that the thing that the empire fears most of all is an honest man who isn't corruptible because he doesn't want those things.
"15 years after Pope Gregory VII undertook major reforms, establishing ultramontane rule over all kingdoms of Europe, Pope Urban II delivered an infamous sermon at the Council of Clermont, consolidating the rule and issuing the orders to crusade, to retake the Holy Lands from the non-believers. Thousands of men, depraved and deprived of knowledge, were convinced to partake in the satanic expedition, as they were promised full exemption from civil jurisdiction and remission of sins. And so they embarked, thousands of them, mercilessly looting and ravishing all in sight, fearing nothing, for all was forgiven. Although they slayed in Christ's name, as they came closer to victory, the one they served as Lord became ever clearer. After the Norman chivalry conquered Jerusalem, envoys were sent to Venice to report the good news. Venice, in turn, immediately sent their own fleets against the weakened Islamic army to capture the ports of Jaffa and Haifa, vital to her own commercial interests. As they prepared to conquer the cities of Tyre and Ascalon decades later, the Crusaders unhesitatingly gave their offerings to their god. A third of each city was allotted to the oligarchy. And it was ensured that within all the kingdoms of the Crusades, a bakery, a bath, a market, and a free quarter were given to the Venetians. They would be exempt from all taxation, while the Christian king of Jerusalem would pay them a tax of 300 bezants annually. The chivalry, with permission by the papacy, went as far as to proclaim that wherever a Venetian went, their laws should follow them, for no law was higher than Venetian law. The only problem the oligarchy encountered in sponsoring these religious wars was that her strategic privileges within Constantinople were threatened. Alexius I of the Byzantine Empire was against the expedition of the Crusaders because they threatened Byzantium's own territories, so he demanded that Venice withdraw. For the rest of the 12th century, measures were taken against Venice by Constantinople, such as the order sent forth by the emperor on March 7, 1171, to arrest and imprison every Venetian within Byzantium's domain. This demonstrated to the oligarchy that her mother was no longer going to play her game, which was troublesome, for without access to the Black Sea, it would be difficult for Venice to secure maritime dominance. All the treasure that lay in the lands of India and China were necessary for Venice to complete her puzzle of extended monetarist practice worldwide. But these crafty devils had no need to fear. A plot lay ready for them to seize as soon as the opportunity arose. At the turn of the 12th century, Saracens waged war to retake the Holy Land from the Norman chivalry. The barons of France and Flanders immediately sent 6 messengers to plead to their birth mother, knowing that only with Venice could they defend themselves. They assembled at St. Mark's, where the ambassadors pleaded to the oligarchy.
Sirs, the most exalted and puissant of the barons of France have sent us to you, and they beg your favor, that you may be seized with pity for Jerusalem, which is in bondage to the unbelievers, and that for God's sake you will consent to aid them to avenge the shame of Jesus Christ. And they have chosen you, because they know that no people on the sea has so great power as you. And they bade us to fall at your feet, and not to rise until you grant that you will have pity on the Holy Land beyond the sea.
All 6 kneeled to the assembly in tears, until Doge Enrico Dandolo delivered the official Venetian reply. Venice assisted the expedition under the condition that they accept a debt of 85,000 marks, the equivalent of 20,000 kilograms of silver. Neither the King of England nor of France generated such an amount annually. As a matter of fact, it would take them nearly 2 years to reach such a sum, and that only if they didn't spend an ounce on anything. Yet, the oligarchy contracted that the debt should be paid within a year. The fools signed Satan's contract, and the result was as Venice expected. The chivalry failed to meet the demands of the contract. The rulers of finance proceeded to utilize their new debt slaves to fulfill the task the empire desired: unchallenged maritime control of the East. Ostensibly, the Venetians only required them to retake their ports in Dalmatia from the Christian kingdom of Hungary. But within a matter of months, Venice's real plot came into effect. By the spring of 1202, 40,000 crusaders, 440 large ships, with 50 galleys were on a direct course towards Constantinople. Upon arrival, as the city walls and gates were broken open, the dogs of war were unleashed, destroying everything, looting from the altars of churches, melting the great statue of Hercules for its bronze, and raping every woman in sight, nuns included. Dandolo and the Venetian fleets kept back, watching their dogs ravish the city. They wanted one thing: the islands and the coasts necessary for their maritime empire, and none amongst the Normans hesitated to grant Venice her desires. Her greatest rival in the Mediterranean was annihilated, and her choices of emperor and patriarch, those who would protect Venetian interests, were appointed. This doge had served the oligarchy well, for Venetian voyages could now continue uninterrupted. With their reassurance of complete maritime dominance, the Venetian oligarchy used their power over the Mediterranean to internationally centralize the control and organization of money within their financial empire. Shortly after the raids in Constantinople, Venice dictated that all exchange of silver and gold bullion could only lawfully occur within her lagoon. Bullion ships sailed twice a year from the imperial center to keep this private market flowing. Through this method, Venice sucked Europe dry of its 500-year-old silver standard and enforced a gold standard upon them. The Venetian gold ducat, minted in 1284 of October 31st, became the lawful currency of international trade. Simultaneously, with the assistance of the Mongolian hordes, Venice forced China and India off their gold standard and forced upon them instead Europe's silver for the wealthy and paper for the poor. Thus, no country could produce bullion for its own use, and all currency exchange had to take place in Venice. During this same interval, the Venetian financial tyranny saw the rise to power of their junior partners in Florence, the family banking houses of the Acciaioli, the Peruzzi, and the House of Bardi, then the largest banking house on the planet. These, among others, were the banks that privatized the revenues of states by providing the usurious loans to most of the kingdoms in Europe and southern Italy. Although they wielded significant power, they were merely practicing the usury and financial speculation which the Venetian-dominated monetary system required. They were loan sharks swimming within a Venetian sea. The floating exchange rate between silver and gold bullion, controlled by the Venetian oligarchy, caused even the gold florian, minted by the Florentine bankers, to devalue to worthlessness. Nevertheless, the Florentine parasites served their master well until they became disposable.
They are lending money to the major houses of Europe, the nations, or what passed for nations at that point, the kingdom, various kingdoms and duchies and things like that. And so they get them into debt. Now, for example, the King of England was in significant debt to the Lombard bankers, which was the Venetian banking system, and in particular to the House of Bardi. And so the king, pledged as collateral the wool production of his kingdom. And then, of course, he's going broke, and so he needs more money, so he borrows more money, and then he pledges all of the sheep as well. The key thing about this kind of debt farming, is that once you incur a debt, the debt never really goes away. Because the interest rates that you have to pay, the money that you have to pay to service this debt, is such that you quit building your country and you start trying to pay your debt. And then you have to borrow more money to pay your debt because you get further behind, and then your interest rates get higher, your debt service becomes more, and you set off on a process that never really ends until everything blows up. But that's the Venetian method of control. And that method has not changed since the days of Venice.
While generating profits of 2/3 on all investments in Europe, the Peruzzi, the House of Bardi, and the others would lure in new debt slaves through the yearly champagne fairs in France, using luxury goods imported from Asia as bait. By the beginning of the 14th century, these Lombard bankers were able to insinuate themselves so far into the administrations of both King Edward II and Edward III of England that they ran the king's personal finances, privatized England's revenues, and then charged England for their services. As part of this business, they convinced foolish Edward III to claim France as part of his kingdom, enticing him to spark the beginnings of the 100 Years' War. Meanwhile, the Peruzzi Bank, through the Franzese bankers, provided the financial services for King Philip IV of France. Thus, through keeping the population in a state of bestiality and manipulating stupid people into wars, the Venetians kept their financial empire on top of the world. But with this practice of monetarism, significant productivity was abandoned, and the body of the state was sucked to the bare bone. The production of wool in England, Flanders, and Spain collapsed. Because of depreciating farmland and equipment, food crises broke out, resulting in repeated famine within the 1310s, 20s, and 30s. The nature of the system caused farmers to go bankrupt, forcing them to hand over their lands to the bankers. For lack of funds and neglect, bridge construction halted, while those built the century before were left to rot. Sanitation was a joke. Monasteries ceased educating the young, and population levels dropped as the system drove further and further towards bankruptcy. The fleas had consumed all the blood of their host. The city of Florence went bankrupt in 1342, and the banking houses of the Acciaioli and the Buonaccorsi followed suit. The Kingdom of France went bankrupt in 1337, and Edward III's England followed suit in 1340. With the fall of these two kingdoms, and Venice playing currencies against each other, the Peruzzi fell bankrupt themselves in 1345, and within the same year, the top bank on the planet, the House of Bardi, finally collapsed. The entire monetary financial system of the 14th century had now entered its phase of complete disintegration. With no legitimate system found to replace the failed one, the conditions were set to pave the way for the great calamity that was about to fall upon Europe. It had already killed 10 million in China, and over the next 2 generations, the combination of plague, social upheavals, and wars wiped out 1/3 to 1/2 of the entire population. In 1508, the League of Cambrai was formed among the significant powers of Western Europe, including Louis XI's heir to the throne and his admirer, Henry VII of England, in an attempt to destroy the monetarist empire still centered in Venice. But with Henry VII's death the following year, and the complicity of the current pope of the time to the Venetians, the League was dissolved. Starting with the Inquisition, and continuing with the promotion of Luther and the Reformation generally, and then supporting the Catholic Church's counter-Reformation, the Venetian Empire had been busy lighting the fuse for religious conflicts throughout Europe. Eventually, among others, they deployed their agent Friar Zorzi to England to manipulate the new king, Henry VIII. They used him to further feed the ongoing frenzy of religious wars by driving him to assume the authority to reform the church in England so he could meet his sexual desires. Fearing the former alliance which sought to destroy the devil, the oligarchy proceeded to move north in search of a new capital from which to operate. They settled throughout northern Europe, opening their first major headquarters in Amsterdam, Holland. Centuries later, they consolidated their true base in 1763, upholding their public political headquarters in London, which remains still today, yet with their satanic souls continuing to reside in Venice. But this shift to the north was not enough. The scientific achievements of Nicholas of Cusa and the Renaissance crippled the era of Aristotle, making his methods worthless to the oligarchy. The creative impulses of the Golden Age caused an explosion of discoveries and innovations which society was not willing to give up. Venice, then the center of the empire, had no choice but to adapt to those conditions, and thus the doctrines of the Venetian Paolo Sarpi came forth, founding what would become modern British liberalism. This new method of the oligarchy allowed innovation while suppressing creative thinking. It said yes to technology, but no to creativity.
the enemy has to be defined properly. Who is the enemy? Well, Cheney is ready for the rubbish bin. He could go quickly. He's earned it. I mean, the Lautenbach report, Lautenbach-Waxman report on the way he's ripped off the American budget, the American till, with his aid of his Halliburton associates, and how he has profited by what Halliburton has done by the way of the steel business, is really puts him in jeopardy. He's not a popular guy. He's hated. Unfortunately, he's also feared, and cowards fear him. But the enemy is not Cheney. Cheney is only a tool, as his wife describes him. The enemy is the Venetian faction. What the problem today in economy, which has to be addressed, and this is where Democrats lose their nerve. In the Senate and elsewhere, they lose their nerve. And it's not that they don't lack inspiring causes to go to, but when they know and they are informed by people like Felix Rohatyn and so forth, that they are treading in dangerous waters, which they might not like to find themselves in, they wince. The biggest of what we have is the defection of Republicans from the Republican cause. Not the Republican Party as such, but from what the neocons represent in the Republican Party. So you have a mass defection of Republicans who cannot support what stinks. But you don't have Democrats, with a few exceptions, who are stepping up to the plate, as it is said, on issues, because they're afraid of what? They're afraid of the financial interests. We have to realize that the enemy of humanity today is the same enemy that Franklin Roosevelt had when he was alive, which sometimes are called the bankers, but he didn't think of the bankers, he had it right. He understood that the financial oligarchy, including the grandfather of the present president, Prescott Bush, had been the authors of funding Hitler's being put into power in Germany. That these people in the American oligarchy, the Wall Street oligarchy, the backers of Coolidge, the controllers of Hoover, these were the people who had put Hitler into power and Mussolini before him and Franco afterward. These were the people who were prepared to support Hitler all the way and his system if he had only gone eastward first against the Soviet Union rather than against France and England. They turned against Hitler. Many of them didn't turn until 1940, but they began to turn against Hitler when it was learned the German military was prepared to strike westward first before striking eastward. So they became anti-Hitler because they didn't like his direction. They liked his methods, but not his direction. And they supported him by bringing fascism, Nazism into power in Germany, and fascism into power throughout continental Europe. Now you understand then, you have to go back to deeper, that fascism, Nazism, which is largely a product of a group known as the Syndicus International. It's a group of bankers in the Venetian tradition. These are independent family banks, family financial interests, which cluster like a slime mold together and have individuality, but they also are a slime. Okay? This is the problem. These guys have come to the point where since 1939, when there was no longer, 1989, since there was no longer a Soviet Union as a contender, they felt free to destroy Western Europe and the Americas because they no longer needed Western Europe and the Americas as an economic and military strength to control the Soviet Union. Once the Soviet Union was gone, they said,
History has ended, as Francis Fukuyama put it. History is now at an end. Now the empire can return. Now, the empire means the Venetian model, which means the British model. It means the Anglo-Dutch liberal model, under which, in their view, the nation state either should not exist, and they intend to eliminate most nation states, which is what the real purpose was in Iraq, not to defeat Saddam Hussein, was to destroy Iraq, which they're doing. Their intent is to destroy Syria. Their intent is to destroy Iran. Their intent is to destroy Israel. The intent is to destroy every part of that region of the world and beyond. And they call them failed states. You know, why does it fail? Because it got killed. That's why it failed. Then what about the other states? Well, they do not want to tolerate in Europe or in the United States a government which does not submit to the power of a financial oligarchy. Now, what these guys are up against is, which Felix Rahat really typifies, is they represent a financier oligarchy which says clusters of these bankers are going to run the world and no government will challenge the authority of these bankers, of their money. That's what the issue is. And they not only use the threat of financial campaigns against politicians and their constituencies, they also kill. They commit murders. They murder officials. They murdered Kennedy. They murdered McKinley. They murdered other people en masse. They are killers. They don't do it personally, generally. They give the orders. And they can find Nazi types like the Pinochet types and so forth who will go out and carry out those orders. That's the way it's done. So there is a genuine fear of these bankers or these financier interests among people who know that they hire killers. Most of the assassinations of the world are run, orchestrated by these financial agencies. They kill. They are poisonous cockroaches in our system, inhabiting the pores of our system. And that's what the problem is. People are afraid of them. Again, the answer, as I said just a while ago, the answer is if you don't have a sense of immortality, of an immortal interest in your life, you don't have the source of courage to make the kinds of decisions that challenge power, evil like that. What they represent, what Felix Rahat typifies in his own small way, is Satan. You want a figure for Satan? That's him. Not him personally as such, but he typifies what is satanic in society today. This is the evil. And people are afraid to stand up against evil. They say, look, I'm willing to do whatever is possible to reform the society for the better. But look, don't get me in trouble.